She smiled at me like she knew a secret, and suddenly, my quiet life felt completely dangerous. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the world seemed to slow down just enough for details to matter. I had stopped by the small cafe near the bookstore, a place I'd passed countless times, but never really noticed. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of pastries, and the soft hum of an acoustic guitar played somewhere overhead. I was alone, buried in my notebook, trying to sketch out the day's thoughts when she appeared. She moved with a kind of effortless grace that made the world feel slower around her. Early 40s, perhaps? Confident yet understated, the sort of woman whose presence didn't demand attention, but somehow commanded it anyway. She wore a tailored coat, the color of deep burgundy, and carried herself like she was both at home in the world and slightly apart from it. There was a quiet elegance in the way her hair caught the light, how her fingers lingered on the edge of the counter as she ordered. Then she looked at me, not in the casual way strangers glance at one another in a cafe, but as if she had paused time for a fraction of a second, letting her gaze take in every detail. Her eyes were sharp, curious, but soft at the same time, warm enough to make my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite name. And then she smiled, a small, knowing smile, the kind that felt like an invitation without words. I don't know why, but my hand paused mid-note, my pen hovering as if afraid to break the spell. Her smile lingered just a moment too long, the corners of her lips tilting upward in a way that suggested mischief, knowledge, and a kind of quiet challenge. There was a subtle rhythm in her movements, a grace in the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the faintest hint of a perfume, soft vanilla, something familiar yet entirely new, brushing against my senses. I felt a flutter in my chest, a mixture of intrigue and hesitation. My thoughts raced, trying to rationalize the irrational. Why was this woman, a stranger, affecting me like this? Why did her laughter, soft, genuine, without effort, echo in my mind long after she had looked away? She spoke then, casually, almost as if commenting on the weather, but her tone held an undercurrent of something unspoken. "You have no idea what you started," she said with a slight smirk, her voice warm, teasing. The words made no immediate sense, yet they settled in my mind like a seed planted in fertile soil. And just like that, she was gone, moving toward the door, pulling her coat around her, leaving behind the subtle chaos of curiosity and the quiet ache of fascination. I remained seated, heart a little faster, hands slightly trembling, trying to remember the exact shade of her eyes, the curve of her smile, the way she seemed both distant and intimately present all at once. It was a moment that felt ordinary yet entirely transformative. I had no idea, at that point, that a single smile and a passing comment would be the first step into something far more complicated, emotionally charged, and utterly captivating than I could have imagined. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but her smile stayed with me. It wasn't just the curve of her lips or the warmth in her eyes. It was something deeper, something that seemed to settle inside me, refusing to leave. Every sound, every fleeting movement around me seemed to echo her presence. The distant hum of a passing car, the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby cafe, even the way sunlight cut across my desk, all of it felt, somehow, infused with her memory. I found myself replaying the encounter over and over. The way she had tilted her head ever so slightly when she smiled, the subtle confidence in her posture, the soft, unhurried way she had chosen her words. "You have no idea what you started." Why did that line stick in my mind? There was something almost playful but also pointed in the way she said it. It felt like a challenge, a door opening that I wasn't yet ready to walk through. Even mundane moments became charged. On my walk home, I noticed the way light filtered through the leaves of the park, and for a second, it felt like she was there beside me, her hand brushing mine as we passed under the shadows. A song playing faintly from a street musician's guitar triggered a memory of the soft acoustic music in the cafe, and I could almost hear her laughter overlaying the melody. Each memory was vivid, tactile, like I could reach out and touch the warmth of her presence, even though she was nowhere near. The more I thought about her, the more I became aware of my own hesitations. The age difference, something I never considered deeply before, suddenly felt both irrelevant and impossibly significant. She carried herself with the grace and quiet certainty of someone who had lived, loved, and learned, while I was still trying to find my footing in the world. And yet, that gap only made the pull stronger, the curiosity more insistent. I began noticing small signs that she might be thinking of me too. A fleeting glance across a crowded room, a message sent and unsent, the almost imperceptible pause when our paths crossed again. There was a silent rhythm developing between us, a private conversation conducted entirely in gestures, glances, and the spaces between words. Each encounter, no matter how brief, left a lingering tension, not uncomfortable, but electric, a quiet energy that made my chest tighten in ways I couldn't ignore. At night, when the city quieted and my apartment filled with shadows and the hum of distant traffic, I caught myself smiling at nothing, replaying her voice, her laugh, the way her fingers had grazed the edge of the counter. It was obsessive, perhaps, but it didn't feel unhealthy. It felt alive. I was waking up to the realization that some encounters don't just pass. They embed themselves, slowly and deliberately, into your consciousness, changing the way you see ordinary life. By the end of the day, I knew I wasn't just thinking about her. I was anticipating her. I didn't yet know why or where this pull would lead, but the seed had been planted. And somewhere deep down, I sensed she knew exactly what she had started. It wasn't planned, the meeting, I mean. Somehow, life had aligned in such a way that we found ourselves in a quieter space than before. A small park bench tucked beneath an old oak tree, its branches swaying gently with the afternoon breeze. The noise of the city felt distant here, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. It was a neutral space, but with her there, it didn't feel neutral at all. She arrived with that same effortless grace, carrying a cup of coffee in one hand, her coat draped casually over her arm. When she saw me, she smiled, that familiar, knowing curve of her lips, and my chest tightened before I even realized it. I stood a little straighter, aware of the subtle heat in my palms, the slight quickening of my heartbeat. We started casually talking about mundane things, the weather, the oddities of our city, books we'd read. But slowly, the conversation shifted. Her eyes softened, and the air between us seemed to thicken with unspoken understanding. She told me a story from her childhood, a small, intimate memory, and I realized I was hanging on every word, noticing the way her voice fluctuated, how her hands moved as she spoke, the slight tilt of her head when she laughed softly. I shared a few stories too, hesitantly at first. Vulnerability wasn't easy for me, but something about her presence made it natural. She listened, really listened, her gaze steady, warm, encouraging. When I paused, unsure how much to reveal, she leaned in slightly, a gesture so subtle I almost missed it, and gave me the smallest, reassuring smile. It was enough to make the words flow, to make the confessions come without feeling forced. At one point, there was a lull. We both just sat there, letting the silence stretch. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was intimate. I could feel the weight of her presence, the warmth radiating from her, even as our bodies remained separated by the narrow bench. Her hair brushed lightly against my shoulder when the wind shifted, and I felt an almost electric awareness of proximity, of closeness without crossing a line. There was a subtle rhythm developing between us, a cadence of glances, smiles, and pauses. I noticed the way she would catch my gaze and hold it a fraction longer than necessary, as if testing, teasing, inviting. I found myself mirroring her movements without thinking, leaning slightly closer when she spoke, letting my fingers brush against hers when reaching for my coffee. When we finally stood to leave, there was no rush to break the moment. Our hands brushed lightly as we walked side by side, a fleeting touch that carried more weight than words ever could. I felt the pull of her presence lingering long after we parted, like a melody that refused to leave my mind. That day, I realized something important. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. I was drawn to her confidence, her warmth, the subtle vulnerability she let me see. And in that quiet, unplanned conversation, the first threads of trust, intimacy, and slow-burning desire began to weave themselves between us. The rain caught me off guard that evening. I had been walking home, earbuds in, lost in my own thoughts, when the sky darkened and drops began to fall, light at first, then heavier, turning the street into a glistening ribbon of reflections. That's when I saw her, standing near the corner of the cafe where we had first met, a delicate umbrella barely shielding her from the downpour. She looked up, saw me, and smiled, that same enigmatic, knowing smile that had haunted my thoughts for days. "Need some cover?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even as my chest tightened. She tilted her head, letting a stray lock of hair brush against her cheek, and laughed softly, the sound carrying over the rain. "I think I might," she said, stepping closer. Our umbrellas collided slightly, forcing us to walk side by side down the slick sidewalk. The first touch was accidental, almost shy, my arm brushing against hers as we navigated a puddle. But it lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. I felt the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her coat, the subtle rhythm of her movements syncing with mine. It was electrifying in a way that had nothing to do with intention, everything to do with presence. She leaned slightly toward me when we stopped at a traffic light, just enough that her shoulder brushed mine, and I became acutely aware of how close we were. The smell of her perfume, soft, subtle, comforting, enveloped me. I could feel the rise and fall of her chest, hear the faint inhale as she adjusted her umbrella. For a moment, time slowed, and the rain became a distant backdrop, fading into irrelevance compared to the closeness between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt clumsy, unnecessary. So instead, I let the silence speak, our shoulders touching lightly, sharing warmth and a quiet intimacy that neither of us yet named. She glanced at me, and I caught the briefest spark of amusement in her eyes, as if she knew exactly what she had done to me. We reached her door, and she lingered, neither of us moving away. My fingers brushed against hers as she adjusted the umbrella, that fleeting contact sending a ripple through my chest. I realized that even a simple touch could carry meaning far beyond itself. Trust, curiosity, and something dangerously like longing. Finally, she smiled, that same teasing, confident smile, and stepped inside. I stayed on the porch for a moment, rain dripping from my hair, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. It wasn't just attraction. It was the first real acknowledgement of our closeness, a tangible spark that made my pulse race and my thoughts spiral. Walking home, I replayed every moment, every touch, every glance. The rain, the umbrella, the accidental brush of hands. All of it seemed like a carefully orchestrated dance. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I wanted more. More moments, more closeness, more of whatever this was, this slow, deliberate, intoxicating connection that neither of us fully understood yet. It was one of those rare evenings where the city felt hushed, as if it too were leaning in to listen. We had ended up at a small, quiet park, the kind where the lamps cast a golden glow over the paths, where the air carried the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. She had suggested we sit on a bench, and somehow it didn't feel awkward to be there together. In fact, the proximity felt natural, like the world had shifted to make room for this quiet intimacy. Our conversation began casually, as always, but the weight of shared experiences slowly drew us closer. She told me about a time when she had felt completely out of place in her own life, about choices she had made and the regrets that lingered in quiet corners of her mind. Her voice was soft, almost tentative at times, betraying a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Yet there was no weakness in it, only honesty. I found myself opening up as well, recounting moments I rarely shared with anyone. Fears about the future, uncertainties about who I was becoming, and the small disappointments that gnawed at the edges of my confidence. She listened, really listened, her eyes never leaving mine, her hand brushing lightly against mine when I faltered, offering a gentle grounding. It was the kind of attention that made the world shrink to just the two of us, a cocoon where nothing else mattered. The subtle physical gestures were electrifying, though quiet. When I reached for my coffee cup, our fingers touched briefly, the warmth of her skin lingering longer than necessary. Her shoulder grazed mine when she leaned in to emphasize a point, a soft brush that sent a ripple through me. Each small contact was loaded with unspoken communication, a silent acknowledgement of the tension between us that neither of us was ready to name outright. There was a moment when a lull fell, and we simply sat, letting the silence stretch comfortably. I could feel the rise and fall of her breathing, the soft rhythm of her heart in the quiet of the night. For the first time, I understood that intimacy wasn't always about words or grand gestures. Sometimes, it was the trust to sit beside someone, to allow them to see the parts of you usually kept hidden, and to offer them the same gift in return. A light drizzle began to fall, and we huddled slightly closer under the edge of the park's lamp. Her hand found mine almost instinctively, the contact gentle, grounding, yet filled with a tension that neither of us could ignore. My chest tightened, my thoughts scattered, and for a fleeting moment, the world outside ceased to exist. By the time we left the park, something had shifted. The unspoken bond between us had deepened, moving beyond curiosity into trust, into understanding, into a quiet recognition of desire restrained by patience. That night, as I walked home with the memory of her hand lingering against mine, I realized that we were both teetering on the edge of something far greater than either of us had anticipated, and neither of us wanted to step back. It was late evening when it happened, one of those quiet moments where the city felt suspended between day and night. The streetlights cast a golden glow on the sidewalk, and the air carried the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. We had met for a coffee, nothing planned, just an ordinary excuse to be near each other. Yet the ordinary had never felt so charged. We sat across from each other at a small table, the cafe mostly empty now, the soft hum of the espresso machine punctuating our silences. I had been trying, for days, to process the feelings building inside me, but seeing her there, so composed and effortlessly confident, made it impossible to hold back any longer. The tension between us wasn't abrupt. It was a slow burn, subtle and pervasive, creeping into every glance, every brush of her hand across the table. She laughed softly at something I said, and the sound made my chest tighten in a way I could no longer ignore. Her eyes caught mine, and for a moment, we both just stayed there, suspended in a shared understanding. I realized then that it wasn't just curiosity or admiration anymore. It was something far more potent. I cared about her deeply, and the thought of hiding it felt impossible. I cleared my throat, my hands wrapped around my cup, grounding myself. I don't want to pretend anymore, I said, voice low, almost hesitant. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't. I like you, more than I probably should, and I think you know that. Her eyes widened slightly, but then a soft, knowing smile curved her lips, that same smile that had first caught me months ago. She leaned back, letting the warmth of her gaze wash over me. I thought you'd never say it, she whispered, almost teasing, though her eyes betrayed a quiet intensity. You have no idea what you started. It was in that moment that the slow-burn tension crystallized into something tangible. I could feel her presence fully, not just as an idea in my mind, but as a living, breathing reality beside me. Her hand rested briefly on the edge of mine, the contact so light it could have been accidental, yet deliberate enough to set my pulse racing. There was a comfort in it, a reassurance, but also a thrill, a quiet acknowledgement that this connection, carefully nurtured over time, was finally being recognized by both of us. We stayed there for a long while, neither of us needing to speak. Words felt unnecessary when the silence between us carried more meaning than anything we could say aloud. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the tilt of her head when she smiled, the way her eyes held mine with a mixture of affection, challenge, and something unspoken but unmistakable. When we finally left the cafe, our hands brushed as we gathered our coats. The contact lingered, a silent promise of what was to come. For the first time, the pull I had felt for so long wasn't just a question or a curiosity. It was real, mutual, and undeniable. And in that quiet, glowing moment, I realized that whatever we had started, neither of us would ever look back. The days that followed carried a quiet kind of magic. We no longer had to wonder, question, or measure the distance between us. The tension that had once hummed under the surface had shifted into a steady, comforting rhythm. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the soft, steady kind of intimacy that fills ordinary moments with extraordinary meaning. We began to carve out small rituals together. Morning coffee became a shared experience rather than a solitary one. I watched her pour cream in her cup just the way she liked, the subtle movements of her hands, the way sunlight caught the strands of her hair. I learned the warmth in her smile when she noticed something small, like the first blooms of spring or the way a street lamp flickered against wet pavement. And she, in turn, noticed the little things about me, the slight hesitation in my laugh when I was nervous, the way I'd absent-mindedly traced the edge of my mug when deep in thought. One evening, we decided to cook together, laughing as we navigated the cramped space of the kitchen. Her hand brushed mine as we reached for the same utensil, and neither of us pulled away. I felt a thrill in that simple contact, a deep satisfaction in the way our bodies moved in quiet sync. We spoke softly, sharing stories from our pasts, teasing lightly, and savoring the comfort of presence without urgency. There was no need for grand declarations. Our closeness spoke louder than words. If there had been moments of tension before, they now felt like gentle echoes, reminders of the journey that had brought us here. Every glance, every small touch, every pause in conversation carried a weight of trust and understanding. She rested her hand lightly on my arm as we walked through a park one evening, her touch grounding me while simultaneously stirring the same flutter I had felt from the very first smile. The age difference, which had once seemed like a quiet obstacle, now felt irrelevant, overshadowed by the depth of connection and the mutual respect we had cultivated. We would sit together in silence as easily as we could talk, letting the ordinary world fade around us. The subtle intimacy, leaning close to whisper a thought, brushing hair away from the face, hands resting briefly together, became our language. It was a slow, deliberate closeness, a romance built on patience, understanding, and genuine care. And then, in one of those quiet, perfect moments, she smiled at me, that familiar, knowing curve of her lips, and I understood fully. I understood that what we had started months ago had grown into something lasting, something neither of us needed to rush. The pull, the tension, the longing, all of it had settled into warmth, into companionship, into a kind of love that didn't need to shout to be felt. As we walked home that night, our fingers intertwined, I realized that the story had come full circle. What began with a smile and a teasing remark had become a bond of trust, intimacy, and quiet joy. We had crossed the threshold from longing to fulfillment, and the world around us, the city streets, the lamps, the quiet hum of evening, seemed to echo the contentment we carried between us. In that moment, nothing else mattered but the simple, profound presence of each other.